I want to do a review about rounding. It seems to be an issue that sometimes people struggle with a little bit. Most people are really good at the basics of rounding. We know, for example, that if you have the number 389 and you want to round to the nearest 10, that would be 390. If you wanted to round to the nearest 100, that would be 400. Or if we had the number instead 722, to the nearest 10 would be 720, to the nearest 100 would be 700. Sometimes when numbers get a little bigger or when we're working with decimals, people have a few more issues, I think. So I want to show you just a sort of a random large number. So let's say we took this number, which is 4,829,458,449,023, and we wanted to round it to something. If we wanted to round it to the nearest trillion, that would be 5 trillion. So how do we do that? How did we get to there? Just to remind you, when we're rounding to a certain value like trillions, we look at whatever is the digit immediate to the right of it. If that digit is 5 or above, under normal rounding guidelines, we round up. If it is not 5 or above, we keep it the same. Every digit other than the digit we're rounding to that appears after it changes to a 0. So a common mistake that sometimes people make when rounding to the nearest trillion is they round to 5 trillion, but then they keep some of the other digits. You shouldn't do that. They all change to a 0. Another issue that people sometimes have is they look at more than just a single digit to the right. Let's round this to the nearest 100,000. So here's our 100,000s place. When we round to the nearest 100,000, what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at every digit that is to the right. We're going to look at the digit that is immediately to the right of that. The digits before stay the same. And then we're looking at this digit here, 4. Is 4 less than 5? Yes. So this stays the same. And everything after it goes to 0. So this number rounded to the nearest 100,000 is 4,829,458,400,000. Here's what some people do, and you should not do this. When some people see something like this, they say, well, yeah, I know this would be a 4, but look, this is going to make this 4 go up to a 5. No, it isn't. It would if you're rounding to the nearest 10,000, but you're not. You're rounding to the nearest 100,000. And so you look only at the digit immediately to the right. Ignore all the other digits. Only the one immediately to the right will matter. And then the other thing that sometimes people struggle with is rounding decimals. So let's look at an example of a number that has both a whole number part and a decimal part. So let's say we wanted to round this to the nearest tenth. We would first look at what digit is in our tenths place, that is a 2, and we then check whatever digit is 2 immediately to its right. If that digit is 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, we round up, otherwise it stays the same. So rounded to the nearest tenth, this is 48.3. When you're rounding a decimal, do not add zeros after the place you're rounding to. This is rounded to the nearest tenth. If you put this instead, your reader is going to think it's more precise. They're going to think, oh, they've somehow rounded this to the nearest hundredth, and this is 0.30 hundredths. Not 0.30 hundredths, just 30 hundredths. So if you're rounding to the nearest tenth, you should have only one decimal place. If you were rounding to the nearest hundredth for this example, you would have 2 decimal places. So remember, it goes tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000s, 100,000s, millions, 10 millionths, and so on. Remember, there is no oneth in a decimal place. It starts with tenths. People in classes sometimes get this mixed up a little bit. This especially seems to be true in statistics classes where you're asked to round to the nearest hundredth. And so people will incorrectly say, oh, that's 48.254. That is not the nearest hundredth. This is the thousandths place. You might also be asked to round to a certain number of decimal places. So if you're rounding to 5 decimal places, so that's decimal place 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you're rounding to 5 decimal places, the 5th decimal place, in other words, the 5th place after the decimal point, is the number you're interested in, and you will only look at whatever is immediately to its right. So rounded to 5 decimal places, our answer is 48.25409. I hope that helps. It is important that you round correctly in all of your math classes. I should also add that what we've done right now, that rule that you learned in elementary school, that if it's 5 or more you round up, that's really only a guideline. That won't always be the case. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to round up. And sometimes you would round up even if your answer were something like this. A word problem, for example, might ask you how many school buses are needed to bring kids to school. And they say, oh, if each school bus can carry 30 students and there are so many students in the school district, how many buses do we need? And if we do the math, we get the answer maybe 28.1 buses. You can't have 1/10 of a bus. But if you rounded down here, you wouldn't have enough buses to carry everyone. So it makes sense that you would say, oh, you need 29 buses, even though if you're following that guideline you learned in the past, this would round normally to 28. Similarly, at other times we might choose to always round down. If I'm rounding deposits that I put into my checking account, I might want to round those down so I don't get overdrawn, right? I wouldn't want to round all my deposits up because then I would think I have more money than I actually do. So when looking at a word problem, if it's a word problem, you have to really look at the context to see how you're going to round it. If it's a problem that just involves numbers rather than an application problem, then you will follow the traditional rules. One related thing I want to talk about just briefly, because it will fit in here as well as anywhere. I say that people have struggled with it sometimes. When we talk about money, first of all, the dollar sign always goes in front, even though we say $40.30. It looks like this. And then when you do math on your calculator, you may end up with an answer at first that looks like this. This is not a correct answer. If your answer is in dollars and cents, you will always round it to the nearest cent, not to the nearest dime. So if you're told to round to the nearest cent, do this, don't do the one above it. If you're asked to round to the nearest dollar, you would just write that. Or depending on what your instructor wants, you could write this. I prefer this typically, but others might want something else. So when you're working with dollars and cents, remember the dollar sign always comes before the value. Remember that if you're rounding it to the nearest cent, you're going to have exactly 2 decimal places after it. If you have any questions, please let me know.